The dust had not yet settled on the main road through Harrow Creek when the big man's shadow fell across the doorway of Doyle's general store, and Florence nearly dropped the jar of preserved peaches she had been lifting onto the highest shelf. She did not know why her hands went unsteady. She had carried those jars 100 times without trouble. She had stood in that store through thunderstorms and fistfights, and the slow grief of burying her father 2 winters past, and her hands had never once trembled. But something about the shape in the doorway, the sheer breadth of those shoulders, the hat pulled low over a face she had not seen in 4 years, made the world feel briefly tilted on its axis. The jar did not fall. She held onto it. She set it carefully on the shelf, dusted her palms on her apron, and turned to face the man who had walked back into Harrow Creek as though he had simply stepped out for a long afternoon and returned before supper. Seth Carson. He was broader than she remembered. 4 years in the high country did that to a man, carved him down in some places and built him up in others. He had a beard now, close-cropped but substantial, the color of dark timber, and his eyes, those steady, pewter-gray eyes she had tried very hard not to think about, swept the interior of the store before they found her. When they did, something in his expression shifted. Not dramatically. Seth Carson had never been a dramatic man, but something loosened behind his eyes, the way a knot eases when tension finally releases, and Florence felt the warmth of it even from across the room. "Miss Doyle," he said. His voice was lower than she remembered, roughened by years of talking to no one but the wind and the pines. "Mr. Carson," she said, and was quietly proud that her own voice came out even. "You look like the mountain treated you well." "It treated me fine," he said, stepping inside and letting the door ease shut behind him. He pulled his hat from his head and held it at his side, turning the brim in his fingers in that old habit she remembered. "Store looks good. Your father keeping up with everything all right?" The question landed like a stone in still water, and Florence watched the ripple of it cross Seth's face the moment she did not answer right away. He read it there in the half-second of her silence, and his jaw tightened. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "When?" "2 winters ago," she said. "January of '79. It was his heart." Seth nodded slowly. He looked around the store again as though seeing it differently now, understanding why she was the one standing behind the counter rather than old Thomas Doyle with his white suspenders and his permanent smell of pipe tobacco. "He was a good man," Seth said. "He was the best man I ever knew," Florence said. "Until recently, anyway." She hadn't meant to say that last part. It slipped out before she could catch it, and the silence that followed it was warm and complicated, and entirely too loaded for a first conversation after 4 years. She reached for a bolt of calico and began straightening it on the counter, giving her hand something to do. "What can I help you with today, Mr. Carson? You must be needing supplies." He was. He bought flour and salt and coffee beans and a new length of rope and 2 boxes of ammunition for his Winchester rifle, and he paid in coin. Mountain men always had coin when they came down, beaver pelts and elk hide having been traded at the fort, and he did not linger more than he needed to. But when he set his coins on the counter and picked up his parcels, he paused at the door. "It's good to be back," he said, as though he were telling her something specific and not just making conversation. "Harrow Creek is glad to have you," Florence said, and meant it more than she let show. She watched him walk up the main road, those wide shoulders cutting through the afternoon light, and she allowed herself exactly 10 seconds of watching before she turned back to her shelves and told herself firmly that Seth Carson coming back to town was simply Seth Carson coming back to town, and nothing more. She did not convince herself entirely. Harrow Creek in the spring of 1880 was not quite the lawless frontier it had been a decade prior, but it was not tame by any measure. The silver mines east of town kept a steady population of rough men cycling through, and the saloon run by a wide man named Aldo Pierce did a business that never slowed. There was a sheriff, Earl Hodges, a decent enough man with a bad knee and a tendency to look the other way when the trouble involved men with money behind them. There was a schoolhouse, a church that held services every other Sunday, a blacksmith named Domingo Cruz who had come up from New Mexico territory, and whose work was the finest for 40 miles. And there was Florence Doyle's general store, which was the true heart of the town in the way that only a place where everyone eventually needed something could be. Florence had been running it alone for 2 years. She was 26 years old, which in 1881 made her something of an anomaly, a woman of that age, unmarried, running a business by herself, and there was no shortage of opinion about it in town. Old Mrs. Hartwell at the boarding house clucked her tongue every time Florence declined another suitor's advances. The minister, Reverend Tilson, occasionally made pointed observations in his sermons about the virtues of a woman finding her proper station, and the men from the mines propositioned her with what they apparently considered flattering directness, at least twice a week. Florence handled all of it with the same quiet, unhurried firmness she had learned watching her father handle difficult customers. She thanked people for their concern and did not change her behavior. She ran the store from before sunrise until after sundown. She kept the books immaculate. She extended credit to families she knew were struggling and collected it graciously when they could pay. She was not unhappy. She had decided that some time ago, sitting alone in the store on a slow Tuesday with the smell of her father's pipe still somehow caught in the walls, she was not unhappy and she was not waiting. She was living. It was simply a quiet life is all. Seth's return disturbed the quiet in ways she had not anticipated. He had taken up residence in the old Yancey cabin at the edge of town, a place that had been empty for 2 years since Bill Yancey moved his family to Sacramento. Seth had apparently arranged the lease through a letter sent ahead, because the key was waiting for him at the sheriff's office. He did not come back to the store for 3 days, which gave Florence 3 days to notice how often her mind turned toward the door and to be irritated about it. When he did come back, it was a Tuesday morning early, before the main trade had started. He came in quiet, the way he always moved, with a kind of unhurried deliberateness that made him seem larger than even his considerable frame warranted. He wore clean clothes. He had been doing laundry or perhaps buying new, and his beard was trimmed a shade neater. He carried his hat in his hand this time from the moment he came through the door. "Morning," Florence said, not looking up from the ledger she was updating. "Morning," he said. He moved to the dry goods section and began picking through what he needed with a knowledgeable efficiency. He had always known how to provision himself. "Busy morning." "Not yet," she said. "Give it an hour." "That how it always is. Like clockwork. The miners come through mid-morning when the first shift changes. Then there's a lull. Then the ranch women come in the afternoon." She turned a page in her ledger. "You pick that up fast when it's your livelihood." He brought his items to the counter and set them down. She began tallying them. He watched her write, which she was aware of without acknowledging. "How long have you been running this alone?" he asked. 2 years, she said. "Since my father passed. No help at all. Young Jimmy Farris comes in on Saturdays to help with the heavy lifting," she said. "He's 14. He works for 2 bits and whatever he can carry home in his pockets, which is usually coffee candy and one of the dime novels I stock, which he thinks I don't notice." She allowed a small smile. "I notice." Seth made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was adjacent to one, a low, brief sound of amusement that she felt in her chest the same way she felt a chord struck well on the piano at the church. "You always did notice everything," he said. She looked up at him then, because that was the first thing he had said that acknowledged that they had a before, a history, that they had known each other in the years before he disappeared into the mountains, back when Thomas Doyle was alive and Seth Carson was the best trapper and tracker in the region, and had come into town every month or so for supplies and stayed sometimes for 3 or 4 days, and had sat on the porch of the store more than once talking to her father about everything and nothing while Florence listened from inside. She had been 22 then. He had been 28. There had been nothing between them, nothing concrete, nothing spoken. But there had been something in the air on those evenings, something that had made Florence's father give her a particular look sometimes, a quiet and knowing look, and she had always been too proud to ask him what he meant by it. Then Seth had gone. He had gone after the winter of '76, after something had happened that Florence had only ever heard in fragments and rumors, something about a woman named Clara Marsh, something about a loss that had driven him from society as certainly as if he had been exiled. She had never known the full truth of it. She had only known that Seth Carson left Harrow Creek in February of '77, and nobody had seen him since. Until 3 days ago. "I tried to," she said simply and looked back down at the ledger. "He paid. He gathered his goods. He moved toward the door and then he stopped and she waited without appearing to wait for whatever he was going to say. 'Is there anything that needs doing around here?' he said. 'Repairs, anything heavy that your Jimmy Farris can't manage?' She kept her face neutral. This was charity, offered carefully and without condescension, and she recognized the care in it. 'The back steps need replacing,' she said. 'Third step cracked through the winter. I've been going around it. I'll bring lumber,' he said, 'tomorrow morning if that's all right.' 'That's all right,' she said. He nodded and went. Florence waited until the door had fully closed, and then she sat down on the stool behind the counter and put her chin in her hand and stared at nothing for a long moment, which she never did during business hours. And then she got up and went back to her ledger because there was work to do, and her life was what it was, and Seth Carson was simply a neighbor who was being helpful. The back steps got replaced. He came the next morning with lumber he had picked up from the yard on the south end of town, and he worked in silence mostly, with the kind of focused competence that comes from years of building your own shelter and relying on your own 2 hands. Florence brought him coffee at mid-morning, and he accepted it with thanks, and they talked while he worked, first about the town, about what had changed in 4 years, about the mine expansion and the new road being graded toward the county seat, and the family of settlers, the Abernathys, who had taken up the old Rionner homestead east of the creek. "Their oldest boy, Marcus, comes in every week," Florence said, sitting on the newly installed top step and watching Seth work. "He's 11. His mother sends him with a list and a very precise amount of money, and he is so serious about the whole business you'd think he was handling state affairs." Seth smiled at that, a real smile, one that changed his whole face. She had forgotten how rarely he smiled and how completely it transformed him when he did. "What do they raise out there?" he said. "Cattle mostly. They brought a small herd. Mr. Abernathy is trying to prove up on the land, get the deed proper. He's a good worker from what I hear. Domingo Cruz, do you remember Domingo, the blacksmith? He says Abernathy's the most honest man he's dealt with in Harrow Creek in 5 years. High praise from Domingo, Seth said. He fitted the last tread and tested it with his boot. These'll hold now. Thank you, she said. Truly, what do I owe you for the lumber? Nothing. Seth. He looked at her directly at her, using her name, or she had used his, and neither of them had acknowledged the shift from Mr. Carson and Miss Doyle until this moment, and now it sat between them, obvious and warm. He held her gaze for a steady count of seconds. Nothing, Florence, he said. Your father was always fair to me. Let me be fair back. She did not argue further because she understood the language of that, the way debts of the heart get settled in the wild country, not in coin but in labor, in presence, in the small, reliable kindnesses. All right, she said. He came back the week after to replace a hinge on the storage room door that had been grinding for months. Then the week after that to help her shift a shelving unit that had been slowly pulling away from the wall. Each time he came, he brought his tools and his competence, and he stayed no longer than the work required, except that the coffee breaks stretched a little longer, and the conversations during them went a little deeper. She learned, over those coffee conversations in the April warmth, that he had gone to the high country after a grief he did not name directly, but that she could hear in the careful way he talked around it. Clara Marsh had been real. There had been a plan, quiet and unspoken, until it was suddenly very spoken. And then there had been a sickness that came fast and cruel. And Clara had been gone before spring of '77. and Seth had not known how to be among people after that. He had gone to the only place that made sense to him, the high peaks and the deep silences and the clean practical business of surviving, and he had stayed until the grief had been not erased, but transformed into something he could carry without it crushing him. Florence listened to all of this without pressing and without flinching. She told him about her own grief, about her father's last months when his heart had been failing and they had both known it and had chosen to talk about everything except that, filling the evenings with checkers and stories and the careful pretending that ordinary life would simply continue. She told him about the night her father died, how she had sat with him through it, and how the store had felt the next morning impossibly large and impossibly quiet. "But you stayed," Seth said. "Of course I stayed," she said, a little surprised by the of course. "It's my home, it's my livelihood. My father built that store with $40 and a borrowed horse and 30 years of showing up every morning. I wasn't going to let it die with him." Seth looked at her over his coffee cup with that gray gaze that always seemed to be seeing more than the surface. "No," he said, "I don't suppose you would." May arrived, and the high country thawed in earnest, and the whole territory seemed to exhale after the long winter. The wildflowers came up in the meadows east of town in great sweeping drifts of blue and yellow, and the creek ran high and clear, and the evenings lasted long and golden. Harrow Creek was at its best in May, before the summer heat turned the dust to something punishing, and the mines attracted more of the rough population that pushed the saloon trade past Aldo Pierce's ability to manage it gracefully. It was in May that Seth began staying for supper. It happened gradually, the way real things tend to. He would finish some repair work, and she would be heating something on the small iron stove in the back room that doubled as her kitchen. She lived in the 2 rooms behind the store, had always lived there. Her whole life was contained in that practical rectangle of space. And she would ask if he was hungry with the particular offhandedness of someone who already knew the answer. And he would sit at her small table and they would eat, and the conversation would unspool naturally for an hour before he would stand and thank her and take his leave with perfect propriety. But the evenings were becoming something. That was the truth of it. The evenings were becoming the part of the day Florence thought about during the parts of the day that were not evenings. The town noticed. Of course the town noticed. Harrow Creek had approximately 340 souls in it, and every one of them had an opinion about Florence Doyle, who had been resisting marriage and living independently for 2 years in a way that made the more conventional citizens vaguely anxious. Seth Carson's reappearance and his obvious and steady attention to the store and its proprietress became the primary topic at Mrs. Hartwell's boarding house breakfast table within about a week. Florence heard the talk through various channels. Mrs. Cruz mentioned it with gentle amusement. Jimmy Farris brought it up with the blunt directness of a 14-year-old who had no idea he was touching anything significant. And Reverend Tilson made a sermon that, while not naming names, was fairly specifically about the importance of men and women properly formalizing their associations. None of it bothered Florence particularly. She had long ago made her peace with being the subject of Harrow Creek's conversational interest. What she had not made peace with, she realized on a warm evening in late May when Seth was sitting across from her at her small kitchen table and laughing at something she had said, a full, genuine laugh. The kind she was realizing he had been slowly working his way back toward, was the way her heart had taken up a new habit of hoping. It was not a comfortable feeling. Hoping required a kind of vulnerability that Florence had not allowed herself in some time. She had built her life on the firm ground of her own capability, and she liked it there. Hoping meant that there was something outside herself that mattered to the shape of things, and that was a complicated proposition. But there Seth was, laughing at her table, and the lamplight was warm on his face, and she thought, all right then. The thing that accelerated everything, because in the territory there was always a thing, was a man named Croft Hands. Croft Hands arrived in Harrow Creek in the first week of June, with two men who worked for him and did not introduce themselves, and he was the kind of man who immediately made himself known as a problem. He was a land speculator, which in 1881 in this part of the territory was a legal but deeply ugly profession, and he had his eyes on several parcels along the creek. He set himself up at the boarding house and began making the rounds with the air of someone who had already decided how things were going to go and was merely observing the formality of telling the locals. He came into Florence's store on his second day in town and looked around with the particular expression of a man assessing property rather than browsing merchandise. He was perhaps 40, expensively dressed for the territory, with a clean-shaved face that somehow made him look less trustworthy rather than more. "Miss Doyle," he said, without having introduced himself. He had clearly already gathered information. "Croft Hands. I've been hearing good things about this establishment." "Then you've been listening to the right people," Florence said pleasantly. He told her his business. He was in town to purchase several properties, he said, to develop the commercial potential of Harrow Creek given the mine expansion, and among the properties he was interested in was the land on which Doyle's general store stood. Florence felt the familiar cold clarity she always felt when something important was at stake. She had inherited the store free and clear with the deed in her name confirmed by the county land office. Her father had been meticulous about legal matters. The land was hers. "I'm not interested in selling," she said. Hands smiled. It was the kind of smile that acknowledged her position without conceding to it. "I understand that's how it seems now," he said, "but I'd encourage you to look at the figures. Running a store like this alone, as a woman of unmarried status, you must find the winters particularly difficult." He set a card on the counter. "Think about it." She waited until he left, and then she put his card in the stove and watched it burn. Over the next 2 weeks, Hands made life in Harrow Creek progressively less pleasant. His men drank at the saloon and started disputes. He visited Sheriff Hodges with impressive frequency, and with a manner that suggested he was used to sheriffs being cooperative. He spoke to the bank manager, a nervous man named Pilcher, and Florence noticed that her credit line, which had always been dependable, suddenly came with complications and delays when she needed to order a major resupply. She said nothing about it to Seth. She handled it. She rerouted her supply order through a contact in Santa Fe she had cultivated through her father's connections, paid cash for the largest portion of the order, and said nothing to Pilcher except thank you for his time. But Hands visited the store twice more, each time with the same pleasant implacability, and the third time he implied, with precise unpleasantness, that a woman running a business in this territory without the backing of a husband or a male partner was in a legally uncertain position regarding some obscure provision of property management he claimed the county was beginning to enforce. Florence did not know enough about territorial law to know if this was real or manufactured, and that was the part that frightened her. She did not show that it frightened her. She told him she would look into it and thanked him for the information, and then she spent the evening in the back room with her ledgers and her father's old correspondence files, looking for documentation. Seth noticed that something was wrong on his next visit. He did not ask directly, that was not his way, but he watched her with a quiet attention that she had come to recognize, and when she finally told him about Hands, she watched his expression go through several careful calculations before settling into something very still and very focused. "What's he claiming specifically?" Seth said. She told him what she knew. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, then said, "Your deed is clear. Filed at the county land office in '71 when my father bought the property. My name was added when he passed. I have copies." "Hands is inventing things," Seth said flatly. "The provisions he mentioned don't exist. I've dealt with men like him before up near Taos 2 years ago. They use the confusion of territorial law, make people feel uncertain about what they own. Then they offer to resolve the uncertainty for a price." His jaw set. "He's a grifter with a lawyer's vocabulary. I suspected as much, Florence said, but suspected and knowing are different things. I know a man, Seth said. In the county seat, lawyer named Aldrich. He's honest, genuinely honest, which is rare enough to be worth noting. I can ride up there, have him look at your documentation, get you a letter that confirms your title is clean and clear and beyond question. Something official that hands can't argue with. Florence looked at him. The offer was practical and generous, and she was aware, suddenly and acutely, of how much she had come to rely on the fact of his presence in Harrow Creek. Not because she couldn't manage without him, because she could and she would, but because his presence had made things easier and warmer and more possible in ways she hadn't known she was missing. "I'll go with you," she said. He looked up from his coffee. "It's a full day's ride." "I know how far the county seat is, Seth." A small pause. "You can close the store for a day. Jimmy Farris can manage. He's more capable than he lets on. He lets on less capability than he has because he's trying to keep his wages reasonable." She said this with complete seriousness, and Seth laughed again, that low, genuine sound, and then he said, "All right, day after tomorrow, early start." They rode out before sunrise, Florence on her brown mare Penny, who was steady and sensible, Seth on a dark roan gelding that moved with the unhurried power of a horse raised in mountain country. The trail to the county seat wound through scrub oak and then opened into long stretches of grassland that caught the morning light like bronze, and the sky above them was enormous and blue and entirely indifferent to the problems of anyone below it, which Florence found comforting in its way. They talked through most of the ride. Not about hands, not about business, they had covered that. They talked about other things. He told her about the high country, about the particular silence of snow falling on pine forest, about the elk he had tracked one autumn for 3 days before deciding not to take the shot, just to see how the story ended. She told him about the winter her father had decided to stock a selection of books and how it had unexpectedly become the most reliable part of their income because the miners' wives were desperate for something to read through the cold months. "What do you read?" he asked her. The question surprised her by its directness. Nobody asked her that. "Everything I can get," she said. "Novels mostly. I'm not ashamed of it. I read all the ones I stock before I sell them, which my father thought was commercially questionable, but never actually stopped me from doing." She watched the grass bend in the morning wind. "I love a story that takes you somewhere completely different. Makes you feel like the world is larger than the view from your own window." Seth was quiet for a moment. "That's why I went to the mountains," he said. "Not books, just the world being larger than what I could see." "Did it help?" "Eventually," he said. "You can't run from grief, I found. You just carry it somewhere quiet and hold it while it changes shape." Florence looked at him sideways, this big quiet man on his mountain horse, and felt something in her chest tighten with tenderness. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly it." They arrived at the county seat by midday, went directly to Aldrich's office on the main street, and spent 2 hours going over Florence's documentation. Aldrich was a trim, methodical man of perhaps 50 who had the rare quality of making legal matters comprehensible without condescending about it. He went through every document with the attention of someone who cared about getting it right, and at the end of 2 hours he sat back and said, "Miss Doyle, your title is cleaner than most I see. There is no legal provision in this territory that supports what Hands has told you. I will write you a letter on official letterhead, citing the relevant statutes that makes this irrefutable." "Thank you," Florence said. "Whoever told you to come here," Aldrich said with a glance at Seth, "gave you good advice." They ate at the hotel dining room, a proper sit-down meal at a table with a cloth on it, which felt strangely ceremonious after a morning on horseback. The dining room was half full of county business people, a judge who nodded at Aldrich across the room, a pair of cattle buyers talking loudly about prices. Florence and Seth sat across from each other and ate, and talked with the comfortable ease of two people who had discovered that they did not need to perform for one another. It was over that meal that Seth said, with the careful quietness of someone who had been building toward something for a while, "I want you to know why I came back." Florence set down her fork. She waited. "I've been in those mountains for years," he said. "I told myself it was because I wasn't ready to be around people, and that was true for a while, but I've known for more than a year that it wasn't true anymore. I stayed because I didn't know what I was coming back to." He looked at her steadily. "Then I got a letter," she frowned. "A letter from whom?" "Your father," he said. "He wrote me in the winter of '78, I think about 6 months before he passed. He must have known he was failing. He got my address through a trapper I'd had contact with. The letter was brief. He just said," Seth paused, chose his words. "He said he had a daughter who deserved a good man and he thought I was one, and that Harrow Creek would welcome me back if I chose to come. That was all." Florence felt the sting of tears very suddenly and blinked it down hard. She looked at the table. Her father, of course. Of course he had done this in his quiet, careful way, not pushing, not arranging, just opening a door. "Why did you wait so long?" she said, her voice steady. "I wasn't ready yet," Seth said simply, "and I was afraid." "Of what?" He looked at her with complete honesty. "Of coming back and finding you married, or gone, or just not being what I'd been thinking about." He paused. "You were exactly what I'd been thinking about, more honestly." Florence looked up at him. The dining room went on around them, ordinary and bustling, completely indifferent. "Seth Carson," she said, "that might be the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me at a dinner table." Something in his expression opened, careful and hopeful. "Is that a good thing?" "It's a very good thing," she said. They rode back in the long, golden light of the afternoon, and the conversation was different now, lighter somehow. Easier, like a door had been opened, and they had both walked through it without quite declaring it. When they arrived back in Harrow Creek as the last light was dying and the stars were beginning, Seth helped her put Penny up in the small stable behind the store, and they stood in the stable doorway with the warm smell of hay and horse around them, and he said, "May I call on you properly? Sunday afternoon." "You've been having supper at my table twice a week for 2 months," she said. "That's different," he said seriously. "That was just being helpful." She laughed, and the sound of it surprised her, full and unguarded, and his face in the dimness looked at her with an expression she could only describe as reverent. "Yes," she said, "you may call on me Sunday." She took Aldrich's letter and presented it to Croft hands on a Thursday morning with the calm efficiency of someone who had already rehearsed the conversation and knew how it ended. Hands read the letter, read it again, and his pleasant expression went through several careful revisions before landing on a controlled neutrality. "I see," he said. "I hope you do," Florence said. "I also shared a copy of this letter with Sheriff Hodges and asked him to note it in the town record. My property and business are fully documented and clear. I don't expect to have this conversation again." Hands looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man recalibrating a situation. He had arrived in Harrow Creek expecting to deal with a woman alone who could be unsettled by ambiguity and polite pressure. He was finding a woman alone who could not be unsettled by anything he had brought to bear, and who had, moreover, acquired efficient legal backing in the space of 48 hours. "Of course," he said, and left. He was gone from Harrow Creek within the week. His men left the same day. Aldo Pierce reported at some length on the improvement to the saloon's atmosphere. Even Sheriff Hodges seemed lighter, as though something that had been pressing on him from the direction of the boarding house had been lifted. Seth came to Sunday supper with his hat in his hands and his hair combed, and Florence had made actual pie, apple, with the last of the dried apples from winter, and they ate on the porch in the long June evening while the fireflies began to appear along the creek and the whole world seemed to be making some kind of gentle argument in favor of contentment. "I want to tell you something," Florence said, as the stars came fully out. "All right. I thought about you," she said. "The 4 years you were gone. Not in a way I admitted to myself, but in the way where you notice something is absent. Like when a tooth comes out and your tongue keeps finding the space." She paused. "I didn't know it was you I was thinking about until you walked through my door again, and then I knew it very fast." He set his pie plate on the porch rail and turned to look at her in the dark. "Florence, I'm not telling you that to put a weight on you," she said. "I'm telling you because you were honest with me over dinner and you deserved honesty back. And I'm not in the habit of waiting until the right moment when the right moment is clearly happening." He reached across and took her hand carefully, as though the gesture were enormous and he wanted to treat it accordingly. His hand was large and work-roughened and warm, and he held hers as though he intended to hold it for some time. "It's happening," he agreed quietly. They sat on the porch like that while the night deepened and the creek ran and the town made its ordinary nighttime sounds around them, and Florence thought, "There it is. There is what all the years were made of. They were made to arrive here." June turned to July, and the courtship, if it could be called that, given how organically it had already grown, became official and openly acknowledged by the town. Seth walked Florence to the every other Sunday church services and sat beside her. He joined her for supper on most evenings. He fixed the things that needed fixing around the store. There were always things that needed fixing around the store, and he helped with the heavy orders when they came in. But it was not a hired hand's presence. It was the presence of a man who had found the place he wanted to be and was being quiet about not leaving it. Harrow Creek had opinions about this, naturally. Mrs. Hartwell declared it about time, with such feeling that it seemed she had been waiting for it specifically. Reverend Tilson, to his credit, appeared genuinely pleased and made a sermon about the good of community and companionship that was warm without being pointed. Domingo Cruz said nothing but made a slow approving nod when he saw them walking together up the main road that Seth understood was high praise. And Jimmy Ferris, on a Saturday morning when Seth was helping unload a flower delivery, said with the direct bluntness of a 14-year-old who had no social filters whatsoever, "Are you going to marry Miss Doyle, Mr. Carson?" There was a small silence. Florence, who was behind the counter tallying a stock list, kept her eyes firmly on the page. "I'm working in that direction," Seth said, without apparent embarrassment, and continued moving flour sacks. Florence wrote absolutely nothing comprehensible on her stock list for the next 5 minutes. It was a July evening, warm and still, with the smell of the creek on the air and a last red line of sunset along the western mountains, when Seth asked her properly. He had taken her for a walk along the creek after supper, something they had done a few times in the milder evenings, and the walk had been the comfortable winding kind that has no particular agenda. He had been quieter than usual, and she had noticed it without remarking on it. He stopped at the big cottonwood tree at the creek bend that everyone in Harrow Creek used as a landmark. He turned to face her. He did not have a speech prepared. This was the kind of man who could not deliver a speech without it sounding false, and she would not have wanted one. But he had a look on his face that she had never quite seen before, a look that had no defenses in it at all, completely open in a way that must have cost him something because it was not his natural state. "I came back to Harrow Creek because of your father's letter," he said. "But I stayed. I knew within about a week that I was staying because of you. Because of what you are. The way you look at a ledger, and the way you look at the mountains, and the way you gave that man hands back his card as though it were a minor inconvenience. I want to stay, Florence. I want to stay for good. I want to build something here with you if you'll have me." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a ring, small and simple, a thin gold band with a single modest sapphire that he had ridden to the county seat to purchase 2 weeks ago without telling her. "Will you marry me?" Florence looked at the ring and then at his face. This man who had come down from the mountains for her, who had been working his way back to the world and had found it here, who held her hand as though it was something precious. She felt the full weight of the moment, the years of her father's patient love, the 2 years of running the store alone, the long habit of her own capable solitude, and she felt all of it not end but transform, become something larger and more inhabited. "Yes," she said. "Seth Carson, yes." He put the ring on her finger, and then he held her face in both his large hands and kissed her, there at the cottonwood tree by the creek. with the last light dying over the mountains and the fireflies rising from the grass. And it was the kind of kiss that comes from genuine longing, patiently born, warm and unhurried and absolutely certain. They were married in September, by Reverend Tilson in the small white church, on a Saturday when the aspens in the hills had just begun to turn gold, and the air had that particular high country sharpness that comes in the first weeks of autumn. Florence wore her best dress, a deep green wool that her mother had brought from Missouri and that she had altered carefully over the years to keep fitting, and she carried wildflowers that Mrs. Cruz had gathered from the east meadow at dawn and woven into something beautiful without being fussy. The whole town came. Harrow Creek did not have many celebrations. A wedding was something people gathered for the way desert people gather for rain, with a kind of relieved and genuine joy. Aldo Pierce closed the saloon for the afternoon and brought his fiddle, and Domingo Cruz brought his guitar, and after the ceremony there was music in the road in front of the church and dancing that lasted until well after dark. Seth danced with Florence once slowly, with a focused seriousness that made her laugh, and then twice more with improving comfort when the fiddle found its rhythm, and by the end of the evening he was moving with a natural ease that surprised her, and she told him so. "You can dance," she said. "My mother taught me," he said. "I hadn't done it in a while." "You've been keeping useful skills from me," she said. "I have depths," he said gravely, and she laughed against his shoulder. They moved their lives together into the rooms behind the store. Seth's belongings were few, a mountain man's possessions are practical and limited, but he contributed what he had, and his presence in those rooms transformed them in ways she hadn't known they needed transforming. He built new shelves in the kitchen. He patched the roof before the first autumn rain. He fixed the window that had never closed properly, which had been letting cold air in for 2 winters. And in the evenings they sat on the porch or at the kitchen table and they talked, or read, or simply kept company in the easy silence of 2 people who are comfortable in each other's presence, which Florence had not known how much she had missed until she had it. The winter of 1881 came in hard in November, a proper high-country winter with deep snow and bone-grinding cold, and Harrow Creek contracted into itself the way small towns do in serious weather, the daily radius shortening, the trading posts and stores becoming essential gathering points, the community pulled tight by necessity. Florence kept the store open through all of it, Seth handling the heavy work of keeping paths shoveled and the store accessible, both of them working the counter together on the busiest days. She discovered in that winter the specific pleasure of working alongside someone you love. It was not something she had expected. She had always been so sufficient unto herself that she had imagined the addition of another person would be complicated, a negotiation of space and method and habit. But Seth moved through the store and the back rooms with a natural consideration, never in her way, always aware of where she was and what she needed. And she found herself unconsciously doing the same for him, and the whole thing ran with a smoothness that felt less like a negotiation and more like a conversation that had found its rhythm. The Abernathy boy Marcus came in one January morning in a state of barely controlled panic. His family's cow had gone through the ice on the creek, and his father had hurt his back pulling her out, and they were worried about supplies if the weather held another week. Florence and Seth exchanged one look, and Seth was out the door within 5 minutes with a loaded pack horse and a jar of the liniment that was good for back injuries, and Florence put together a box of necessaries and had it ready when Marcus came back around with the family's old wagon, and the whole thing was handled before the morning was half over. It was small. It was the kind of thing that happened constantly in the territory, neighbor helping neighbor because that was how you survived. But Florence watched Seth load that pack horse and felt a specific gratitude for who he was, not just for her, but in the world. He was the kind of man who made the world around him a little more solid. She had not known until now how much she had been wanting to build something with that kind of man. In February, she knew she was expecting. She told him on a quiet Sunday evening after supper, sitting at the kitchen table with the fire warm and the snow coming down outside the window in the steady way of a storm that intends to last. She told him simply, watching his face, and she saw the moment he absorbed it, a stillness, and then a filling of that stillness with something that moved in his eyes like light on water. He reached across the table and took both her hands. He did not speak for a long moment. "Florence," he said finally, his voice low and not entirely steady. "Are you well?" "Very well," she said. "Perfectly well." He stopped, started again. "That's the finest thing you have ever told me." "I told you I'd marry you," she said. "The second finest thing," he said, and she laughed, and he got up and came around the table and held her with the careful intensity of someone who has been given something they had not expected to be given and intends to be worthy of it. The pregnancy was uncomplicated, which was a mercy given the distance from any real medical care. There was a woman, Mrs. Santos, who had served as midwife for a dozen years, and who had the calm authority and practical skill of someone who had seen every kind of delivery, and was not alarmed by any of them. She visited Florence 3 times over the spring months, and pronounced her healthy and forthright, and said the baby would come in September if her counting was right. Seth became, over those months, the most attentive man Florence had ever encountered in her immediate vicinity, which she simultaneously appreciated and found mildly amusing. He built a cradle in the evenings, working by lamplight with a precision and care that was not what you'd expect from a man whose previous life had been largely concerned with practical wilderness survival. He consulted with Domingo Cruz, who had 2 children of his own, about what a baby required, and apparently made a very comprehensive list. He stocked the store's small supply of medicines with particular attention to what Mrs. Santos told him would be useful. "Seth," Florence said one evening, watching him sand the cradle for what she believed was the 4th time, "it's perfect. The corner joints could be smoother," he said. "The baby will not be evaluating the corner joints." He looked up at her, this woman who was carrying his child in the warmth of the lamplight, her face bright with good health and amusement, and his expression was something she would remember for the rest of her life, complete and uncomplicated happiness, settled in him like a man who has come home and put down a heavy pack and intends to stay. September brought an early cool snap, and the aspens turning, and their son into the world on a clear Tuesday morning, born with what Mrs. Santos called good lungs and excellent timing. Seth was there through all of it, which was not the custom men generally waited outside, but Florence had told him plainly that she expected him present, and he had not considered arguing with her about it for even a moment. He held her hand and was steady throughout in the way she had come to know was his most essential quality, that absolute unshakable steadiness. When it was done and Mrs. Santos laid the baby in his arms, Seth Carson, who had come down from the mountain and found the thing worth staying for, held his son with the careful reverence of a man who understands he is holding the best thing in his life, and did not say anything for a long while. "He needs a name," Florence said from the bed, watching them. "Thomas," Seth said without hesitation, "for your father." Florence felt the tears come then, not distressed tears, but the kind that come when something is so exactly right that the heart has no other response available. "Thomas," she agreed. Thomas Carson arrived in a world that was still very much the frontier, still rough in its edges and uncertain in its promises, but arrived into a household that was warm and ordered, and full of the specific gravity that comes when 2 people who have each survived their own varieties of loss decide to build something permanent together. The store continued to thrive. Seth became, over the following year, not a shopkeeper. That was not his nature, but a man who supplemented the store's operations with his mountain skills in ways that proved genuinely valuable. He hunted and trapped through the lean months, bringing in income that padded the slow seasons. He became the person the ranchers and settlers around Harrow Creek turned to when they needed tracking work, or when a horse or a cow went missing in the hills, or when the land required reading in the way that only someone who had spent years in close conversation with it could manage. His reputation spread through the region, the mountain man who had come down and settled, who knew the high country better than anyone alive in that territory, whose word was good and whose skills were remarkable. Men rode from 2 and 3 days away to hire him for specific work, and Florence quietly adjusted the store's accounts for the variable income this created, and found that the whole thing balanced beautifully. Jimmy Farris turned 16 and became a proper paid employee of the store, which he announced to his family with great seriousness. He was growing into a thoughtful young man with a genuine gift for figures that Florence recognized and encouraged, and she began teaching him the accounts in earnest, with an eye toward what she knew he did not yet know he was capable of. The second winter was gentler, as though the territory was offering a grace period for a household with a new baby. Thomas was healthy and demanding, and observed the world with serious gray eyes exactly like his father's, and the store was full enough mornings and evenings of Domingo Cruz's wife Maria, and Mrs. Abernathy from the East Creek homestead, and Mrs. Hartwell, who had entirely changed her tune about Florence's domestic arrangements, and now considered herself a personal advocate for the Carson household's well-being. It was in that second winter that Florence found herself sitting at the kitchen table late one night after Thomas had finally settled. He was a persistent fighter against sleep, was Thomas, treating rest as a significant inconvenience with the store ledgers open, and a cup of cooling tea, and the overwhelming sense that her life had become something she could not have constructed or predicted from the vantage point of any of its earlier moments. She had grieved her father so genuinely, so thoroughly, that she had not expected to find happiness of this particular depth on the other side of that grief. She had kept the store as an act of loyalty to everything he had built, not as a bid for joy. And somehow the loyalty had led her here to Seth, to Thomas, to this warm kitchen in the middle of a territory winter, to this life that was daily and full and entirely her own. She heard Seth come in from checking the horses. He always checked the horses last thing. It was as fixed as sunrise, and he came into the kitchen and looked at her at the table with the ledgers and the cooling tea, and without a word he picked up her cup and carried it to the stove and poured it out and brought her a fresh hot cup and sat down across from her. "All right," he said. "Wonderful," she said, and meant it without reservation. Spring came again, the second spring of their marriage, and Harrow Creek went on being Harrow Creek with all its ordinary dramas and small dignities, and the particular mix of rough edges and genuine community that characterized every small western town of the period. There were new settlers, a family named the Daltons who set up a furniture operation in a building on the south end of Main Street, and their youngest daughter immediately became Thomas's first playmate in the way that babies become playmates, which is to say by being placed near each other and observed by their respective parents. A circuit court judge came through in April and held session for 3 days and resolved a land dispute that had been festering between 2 ranching families for 2 years, and the resolution, while not making anyone entirely happy, at least converted active hostility to resigned acceptance. Domingo Cruz shod the judge's horse, and the judge, who knew good work when he saw it, wrote a letter to his counterparts at the county seat recommending Cruz's services, which resulted in a significant improvement in the blacksmith situation. Seth took on a job in May that took him away for a week. A rancher 40 miles north had cattle going missing into the hills and suspected either rustlers or mountain lion territory overlap, and wanted Seth's read on it. He returned with the answer. It was lion territory, specifically a female with a young one who had expanded her range following the previous year's unusually hard winter and subsequent prey movement. And the rancher was satisfied enough to pay generously and spread the word further. Florence ran the store for that week alone, with Jimmy Ferris's full days helping, and Thomas in the playpen Seth had built in the back room. And the week went smoothly because she was entirely capable of a week of smooth operation. But when Seth rode back up the main road on a Friday afternoon and came through the store door with dust on his coat, and his hat pushed back and that particular quiet brightness in his eyes that meant he was glad to be home, she allowed herself to fully feel the gladness of his return, not because she had been struggling without him, but because the world was simply better with him in it. He picked up Thomas from the playpen, and Thomas, who was past a year old now and very opinionated about most things, immediately grabbed for his father's beard with the focused concentration of a person conducting an important experiment. Seth bore this with complete patience and carried the boy on his arm while he used his free hand to reach into his coat and produce a small parcel. "What is this?" Florence asked. "There was a bookseller in the town near the rancher's place," he said. "I thought you might not have this one." It was a novel. She had not read it, a recent one, the kind of story that arrived in the territory months after its Eastern publication and was passed from household to household until the binding gave out. She looked at the worn, careful cover and then at her husband, this man who had ridden 40 miles to track lions and come home with a book for her because he had remembered she loved them. "You," she said, "are a very good man, Seth Carson." "I try to be," he said, completely without irony. She kissed him there in the back room of the store with Thomas watching from his father's arm with the wide gray-eyed attention of a child who is cataloging everything about the world. And the afternoon sun came through the back window and lay in golden rectangles on the wooden floor, and she thought, "This is what my father saw. This is what he wrote that letter for. He saw this from further away than I could see it from, and he opened the door." Thomas took his first steps in June, in the store, heading from a flour sack to Florence's knee with the shaky, determined concentration of a person who has decided that standing and moving are simply skills to be mastered like any others. Seth, who happened to be behind the counter restocking the rifle ammunition when this happened, went very still and then came around the counter to crouch on the floor at Thomas's level, his face entirely undone with the kind of joy that a man who spent 4 years alone in the mountains learns to feel with his whole self. "Come on then," he said, holding his hands out, and Thomas took 3 more steps and fell against his father's chest, and Seth caught him and held him, and Florence, watching from behind the counter, made no attempt whatsoever to control the tears. The summer was good. The summer was one of those stretches that come occasionally even in hard lives, where for a season everything is simply good, the weather fair, the trade steady, the community functional, the personal life abundant in exactly the ways it should be. Seth and Florence moved through those months in the particular ease of 2 people who have found the frequency of their lives synchronized, who know each other's rhythms and needs and moods, and who navigate the ordinary frictions of shared life with the generosity that comes from genuine mutual regard. They had evenings on the porch after Thomas was down, where the whole territory spread out in the dark around them, and the sky was relentless with stars, and Seth would talk about the mountain constellations he had learned to navigate by, and Florence would tell him about the book she was reading, and they would sit close together and feel the vastness of the land and the smallness of one life in it, and find each time that the smallness was not diminishment but intimacy. The world was large, and they were in it together, and that was exactly sufficient. Autumn of 1882 brought the news, via the weekly stage that came through from the county seat, that the mine expansion had been approved at the territorial level, which meant Harrow Creek would grow substantially over the next 2 years. This was a complicated piece of news for a town that had its own character. More people meant more trade, but it also meant more of the disruption that follows raw economic expansion in the territory. Florence and Seth talked about it carefully, from every angle, the way they had learned to talk about the things that mattered. More trade was good. Harrow Creek needing a larger, better-stocked general store was good. The inevitable influx of single rough men from the mining labor pools was a known challenge they had seen managed well and managed badly by different towns, depending primarily on the quality of the law enforcement. "Hodges is decent," Seth said, "but he won't be enough if it comes in hard." "He knows that," Florence said. "He's already written to the territorial office about a deputy." "Good." Seth was quiet a moment. "Do you want to stay if it gets rough?" She looked at him. "This is my home," she said. "This is my store. I stayed through everything else. I'll stay through a boom." "I know," he said, and the small smile said he had already known her answer, that he had asked not because he doubted it but because he wanted to hear it. "I'll stay with you." "I'd have expected nothing less," she said. The deputy arrived in November, a younger man named James Tolliver from the territorial capital, who had the kind of quiet authority that did not need to be asserted loudly to be effective. He moved into the boarding house and immediately became one of Florence's regular customers, stopping in most mornings for coffee beans and whichever dime novel was freshest, and within a few weeks had earned the cautious respect of the established residents. Harrow Creek moved into 1883 with its population beginning to expand and its character under negotiation. As boomtowns always are, the question of what kind of place it would choose to be in the years ahead still open. Florence had her view on it, and she expressed that view the way she expressed everything, through consistent, reliable action. She ran a fair store. She extended credit to the families who needed it and collected it without judgment when they could pay. She stocked the books and the school supplies and the medicines as thoroughly as the luxury goods, because a community needed all of those things, and a good store stocked what a community needed. Seth became, without particularly planning it, one of the key points of stability in the expansion period. His knowledge of the territory and the people in it, his absolute reliability and his reputation earned him a natural authority in the outdoor trades that the incoming miners and workers quickly recognized. He was not a lawman, not a judge, not a politician. He was a man who knew the land and kept his word and treated people straight. And in an expanding frontier town, those qualities were worth more than any official title. They had their second child in the spring of 1883, a girl this time, born in March with Florence's brown eyes and Seth's stubborn temperament, as demonstrated within her first week of life by her approach to the whole business of existing. They named her Ellen, for Seth's mother, who had died when Seth was 12, and whom he spoke of rarely but with a specific tenderness. Ellen arrived into a household that was ready for her and a town that was growing around her, and she brought with her a completeness that Florence felt in her bones, not the finality of no more, but the fullness of enough, of abundance, of a life that had been built carefully and well, and was now fully inhabited. Thomas, nearly 2 now, regarded his sister with deep suspicion for approximately 1 week, and then adopted her with a possessive enthusiasm that required management on his parents' part. He was, Seth observed one evening, going to be the kind of person who decided what things were, and then committed fully to that decision, which Florence confirmed was very much a Carson family trait. The summer of 1883 had its difficulties. The boom brought disruptions the town was still learning to manage, and there were weeks when the main road had a freer and rougher energy than anyone fully wanted. But it also had its beauties, its moments of community at its best. The way the whole town came together when a fire took the south side of the Dalton furniture shop and rebuilt it in 3 days. The school committee that Florence helped organize, pushing for the schoolhouse to have real books and a proper teacher on a proper salary. The evening in August when Domingo Cruz's daughter turned 15 and there was music in the road and the whole town danced again, and Seth danced with Florence without any self-consciousness at all now, with the easy, natural pleasure of a man who has reclaimed things he thought he had lost. She watched him that August evening, dancing with Ellen in his arms, the baby too young for sleeping through celebration, turning slowly in the lamplight with his daughter against his shoulder, his face comfortable and warm, and she felt the full gathered weight of everything. Her father's faith, her own stubbornness, Seth's long road down from the mountain, the particular grace of having found each other after separate losses, the children who were the best evidence that the world intended good things to happen sometimes. She walked up to him when the song ended, and he looked at her with that look she knew better than any other look in the world, the one that had no defenses in it, that had been present from the moment at the cottonwood tree and had only deepened in the 2 years since. "What are you thinking?" he said. "I'm thinking that my father was a very wise man," she said. Seth smiled, full and warm, the smile that still changed his whole face. "He was," he said. "He knew what I hadn't figured out yet." "What was that?" "That the reason to come down from the mountain wasn't to come back to what was," Seth said. "It was to come forward to what could be." He looked at her steadily, with all the gray honesty she had come to build her life on. "You were what could be, Florence. You still are, every single day." She stood there in the road with the music starting up again and her daughter in her husband's arms and her son somewhere in the crowd being expertly herded by Mrs. Cruz, and the mountains rising black and enormous against the stars to the west, the same mountains that had held Seth Carson for 4 years while he healed himself into someone who could come back and stay. She stood there, and she thought, this is the whole of it. This is what it looks like when everything that was supposed to happen finally does. The years that followed in Harrow Creek were years of building. The town grew, found its better character through the ordinary negotiations of a community deciding what it valued, built a proper school with a full-time teacher, named Miss Pruitt, who Florence and several other women had campaigned the town council into hiring with very little patience for the council's initial hesitations. The mine expanded again and brought prosperity and challenge in equal measure, as such things always do, but also brought families, women and children, and the whole domestic weight of people making permanent lives. And the families changed the town's center of gravity in ways that mattered. Seth's business, the tracking, the wilderness consulting, the work that took him into the high country periodically, but always brought him home, became a recognized and valued fixture of the regional economy. He trained 2 younger men in the years that followed, passing forward the knowledge of the land in the way that good knowledge should be passed, freely and without hoarding. One of them was Marcus Abernathy, who had grown from the serious 11-year-old with his mother's grocery list into a serious 17-year-old, who had discovered that he had a genuine gift for reading land, and whether that matched Seth's own. Florence watched Seth teach Marcus one afternoon from the porch of the store. The 2 of them crouched over a track in the dirt of the road, Seth patient and specific, and entirely in his element as a teacher, which had surprised her when she first saw it because he was such a private man. But some knowledge demands to be passed on and knows it, she thought, and the knowledge of the land was like that. Thomas grew into a quiet, capable boy who resembled his father in movement and temperament, and his mother in stubbornness and love of books, a combination that Florence considered optimal. Ellen grew into a decisive and emphatic child, who had opinions about most things from a very early age, and expressed them with a clarity that made Seth and Florence exchange looks of equal parts amusement and recognition. There was a 3rd child in 1885, a boy they named Will, who arrived in the summer with a cheerful, uncomplicated temperament that seemed to have been specifically designed to provide balance in a household otherwise populated by serious and complicated personalities. Will liked horses and sunshine and was agreeable about most things, which Thomas and Ellen treated as a personal eccentricity in need of correction. The store grew with the town. Florence expanded its footprint twice in those years, buying the adjacent lot when it became available, and building a proper expansion that allowed a real dry goods section and a bigger book inventory, and eventually a small post office function that the growing town needed. She hired 2 full-time employees in addition to Jimmy Farris, who by his 18th birthday was effectively the store's manager in everything but name, and whose wages Florence had adjusted accordingly. She told Jimmy one afternoon, when he was going over the quarterly accounts with the focused competence of someone who had grown into the work, that her father would have been very pleased to see what the store had become. "He'd have been pleased to see what you've made it," Jimmy said, with the directness he still had. He was 18 and had not yet learned to soften things. "My father says Thomas Doyle built it, but you built it into something." Florence straightened a row of canned goods on the shelf behind her, gave herself a moment. "That's generous," she said. "It's accurate," Jimmy said, and went back to the accounts. She told Seth this story that evening, sitting on the porch in the autumn dark, and he listened and then said, "Jimmy's right," with the simplicity of a man who has no particular investment in anything except telling the truth. "My father built the foundation," Florence said. She was looking at the mountains, the dark shapes of them against the dimming sky. "I just built on top of what he gave me." "That's how it's supposed to work," Seth said. He put his arm around her, this woman beside him on the porch, and she leaned into him with the ease of years of evenings like this one, the comfort of a body you know as well as your own. "He gave you the foundation. You built the walls and the roof." And now he looked back through the window at the warm lamplight of the kitchen where Thomas was reading to Ellen at the table while Will sat at their feet playing with a carved horse Seth had made him. Now there are people inside it. Florence turned her face into his shoulder for a moment. The feeling was old and familiar and always new, the specific gratitude of a life that had found its shape. There were harder years in there too. She would not pretend otherwise, not in her own honest accounting of things. The winter of 1886 was brutal, and took the Abernathy's oldest cow and 2 of their horses and put Mr. Abernathy down with a lung sickness that scared everyone badly before he recovered. There was a drought summer in 1888 that stretched the resources of every family in the territory and required Florence to make difficult decisions about credit, extending more than was strictly financially prudent, because the alternative was watching families go without food, and that was not a decision she was prepared to make in the wrong direction. She made up the difference in the ledger later, over 2 years of disciplined accounting, and never mentioned it. Seth was gone for 3 weeks in the hard winter of 1887, tracking a lost prospector into the hills north of the county seat, a job that Sheriff Tolliver had been made sheriff proper by then. Hodges, having retired to his sister's place in California, had brought to him specifically because no one else had the range to do it. He found the prospector, alive but badly frostbitten, in an old ute shelter on the 4th day, and brought him back. Florence spent those 3 weeks running the household and the store and sleeping poorly, not from doubt in Seth's capability, but from the simple knowledge that the mountain country is not sentimental about even the best woodsmen. When he rode back in, she came out of the store and stood in the road and watched him come, and when he dismounted she walked into his arms without saying anything at first, and he held her with both arms wrapped around her the way he held things that mattered and said against her hair, "All right, I'm back." "I know," she said. "I can feel that you're back." They did not make a drama of it, not out loud. They went inside and she heated soup and he ate and told her the story. And Thomas listened with wide eyes and Ellen demanded details about the shelter construction. And Will fell asleep on the bench seat with his head on the table before the soup was half finished. An ordinary evening in every way except the particular relief of it, the specific texture of a household that had briefly been incomplete becoming complete again. By the time Harrow Creek entered the 1890s, it was a proper town, still western, still rough in its edges, still fundamentally a place where life required real competence to manage, but a town with schools and churches and businesses and families and the accumulated weight of community. The mines had made it, and the mines had shaped it, and the mines were beginning their long, slow decline, which would in time require Harrow Creek to find out what it was without the economic center the silver had provided. But that reckoning was still years away, and in 1890 the town was still vital and full. Florence Doyle Carson, 35 years old and not slowing down by any measure, was one of the central figures of it, recognized not with any official title, but with the particular regard that a community gives to the people who show up for it consistently and well, year after year, in all conditions. Her store was the most reliable institution in Harrow Creek. Its credit practices had kept families fed through hard years. Its book inventory had educated half the children in the territory. Its proprietress was the person you went to if you needed to know something, whether that something was the price of flour or the way to file a land claim or the name of the best lawyer in the county seat. Seth built her a new counter for the store in the spring of that year, bigger and better fitted, with drawers that ran smoothly and a surface of polished oak that Florence ran her hand along on the first morning and said was the finest piece of furniture she had ever owned. He had worked on it through the winter in the evenings in the back of the livery stable that Domingo Cruz let him use as a workshop, and Thomas, at 14, had helped with the finishing work, and both their names were scratched underneath one of the drawers where Florence found them a week later and stood in the back room by herself for a full minute before collecting herself. On a September evening, the aspens gold again, as they had been when she had married Seth all those years ago. Florence sat on the porch in the last of the afternoon light and allowed herself the luxury of looking back across the whole of the thing, the whole shape of how it had gone. Her father had seen something she couldn't see yet and had quietly opened a door. Seth had found that door after years of being somewhere else, had been ready to walk through it only when he was ready, and not one moment before. She had been here, keeping the store and keeping herself, not waiting but living, and then he had come through the door and the whole architecture of things had shifted into its proper configuration. They had built a business, a home, a family, a place in a community that was itself still being built. They had done it through the ordinary heroism of showing up consistently, through the droughts and the winters and the boomtones and the grief years and the beautiful ordinary evenings on the porch, with the stars enormous over the mountains. Seth came out and sat beside her, the way he had sat beside her on so many evenings that the gesture had the deep groove of pure habit in it, comfortable and absolute. He looked at the mountains and she looked at the mountains, and the aspens shook in the evening wind and scattered gold across the road. "Thomas asked me today if I'd teach him to trap in the high country," Seth said. "Properly. Take him up for a season." Florence considered this. Thomas was 14 and Seth was 42, and the mountains were real and the season would be cold and long, and she was his mother, and also she knew her son and knew his father and knew that this was exactly the right thing for both of them. "When would you go?" she said. "Spring, if you can manage." "I can manage," she said. "I've been managing since before you came down from the mountain." He looked at her sideways with the look she loved, the quiet amusement that lived right at the edge of the gray eyes. "You have," he said. "Take him up," she said. "Show him everything you know, he'll need it." Seth was quiet for a moment. "You're not worried?" "I'm terrified," she said honestly. "I'll be terrified every day, and I think you should take him anyway." He reached over and took her hand, the gesture as natural as breathing now, the specific weight and warmth of his hand entirely known to her. "All right," he said. Ellen came out of the store behind them and sat on the step below the porch, pulling her knees up and looking at the mountains with her mother's brown eyes. "What are you talking about?" she said. "Thomas going to the high country with your father in the spring," Florence said. Ellen considered this with her characteristic focused attention. "I want to go too," she said. "When you're older," Seth said. "That's what you always say." "Because it's always the right answer." Ellen made a sound of dignified disagreement and went back inside. Florence and Seth listened to the sound of the household Ellen's footsteps, Will's laughter at something, the dog they had acquired the previous year barking once at something outside and then settling the house full of the evidence of itself, warm and inhabited and real. "Seth," Florence said. "I'm glad you came back." She said it simply, the way the most important things deserve to be said, without decoration, without performance, in the full honesty of meaning it completely. "I know it wasn't easy coming back. I know the mountains were a kind of safety after everything. I know what it cost you to come down." He was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved through the aspens. "It didn't cost me," he said finally. "That's what I found out. I thought it would. I thought coming back meant giving something up." He turned and looked at her, this woman who had been the reason he came back and had turned out to be the reason for everything else too. "It turns out it was the opposite. Coming back was when I started gaining things." "Your father's letter," Florence said. "You still have it." "In the drawer of the night table," he said. "I've had it there since we moved in." She nodded. She would always carry her father's love with her that way, not as loss but as the thread connecting her present to her past, the evidence that the love you build with a person does not end when the person does, but continues forward in the choices it enabled, the doors it opened, the family it made possible. "He would have liked you very much," she said. "I know," Seth said. "He already did." A pause. "I liked him first, though," she laughed. The sound went up into the evening air, and the aspens caught it, and the mountains held it. All that landscape that Seth Carson knew by heart, the territory he had chosen to leave and chosen to return to, the high country and the creek and the main road and the porch where he sat now with his wife's hand in his, old enough now to have earned the ease they had found together. The years ahead were full. The country was changing, not just Harrow Creek but the whole territory, the whole West, pressing towards something that would eventually become a different kind of civilization with different requirements. Florence and Seth would live through those changes in the particular way of people who are rooted adapting, adjusting, keeping what mattered and releasing what didn't, doing the continuous work of building a life that fits the world you actually live in rather than the world you remember or imagine. Thomas went to the high country with his father in the spring, and came back in the autumn with the same quiet depth in his eyes that Seth had always carried, the marks of having been somewhere significant and learned something that words weren't quite equal to. He walked into the store and hugged his mother with a force that surprised her and said, "I understand now." And she held him and said, "Good," and did not ask him to explain, because some understandings were not for explaining. Ellen grew into exactly the person her early character had promised: decisive, principled, with her mother's gift for running things and her father's gift for reading people and situations true. She would be the person who, in her own time, decided what she was and committed fully to it, and Harrow Creek would be the better for it. Will grew up cheerful and competent, and became a man who found joy in the ordinary without finding the ordinary insufficient, which is rarer and more valuable than most people recognize. And Florence Doyle Carson stood in her store, her father's store, her store, expanded now and solid and entirely real, on a morning that was neither extraordinary nor ordinary, but simply one more day in a life built with care and love, and the refusal to give up on the things that mattered. And she looked across the room at her husband coming through the door with his hat in his hand, and his gray eyes already finding her, the way they always did. The way they had found her that first day 4 years after he left, and everything that had always been possible between them finally began, and she thought, there it is. There is the whole of the story. The mountain man nobody in town had seen in 4 years had come back down. She was the reason he came. She was the reason he never left again. And the life they built together in the dust and gold and enormous sky of the wild country was the truest thing either of them had ever known. Not perfect, not without its griefs and its difficulties and its long cold winters, but true and warm and entirely, abundantly enough.